welcome to Westside Unitarian Universalist Church. We're happy to see all of you on this lovely, sunny, if a little chilly, East Tennessee morning. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, we're especially glad to have you with us. My name is Linda Phippen, and as a member of the worship committee, I will be assisting our minister, Carol Bedeau, with today's service. Before we get started with the service, I do have a few announcements. First, I would like to remind you that the Share the Plate partner for this quarter is our national denominational group, the Unitarian Universalist Association. If you would like to make a Share the Plate donation, you can do so using the Make a Donation button on the Westside website. Be sure to check the Share the Plate box on the donation form. The web address for the donation section of the website will also be posted on today's Zoom chat room, or the chat box. Also, on Thursday, this coming Thursday, the 25th, we will have religious exploration at the usual time of 6:30 to 8 p.m. via Zoom. This week's topic will be Black history and social justice. If you have not previously attended a religious exploration meeting and need a Zoom link, please contact Wendy Weiss. Next Sunday, the 28th, can't believe it's the end of February already, there will be a compassionate conversation session from 9 a.m. to 9:50 via Zoom. The topic will be What's Bugging You Now? Does anybody else have any announcements that they need to make? Okay, I will now turn things over to Reverend Carol to begin the service with the ringing of the Tibetan bowl.
I invite you all. Hopefully you can hear me. Let's see if you can hear me. First, let's just check in. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Okay. Good, thank you. Our technology is challenged today. So I'm gonna invite the bowl to sound 3 times. And I'm gonna just invite you to take a few deep breaths and come into this moment, into this circle, and just allow yourself to relax and be fully present.
For our chalice lighting this morning, Reverend Carol will light the chalice, and in keeping with today's theme of religious exploration, this is a reading from Julian Lipp entitled, Open to Unexpected Answers. We seek our place in the world and the answers to our heart's deep questions. As we seek, may our hearts be open to unexpected answers. May the light of our chalice remind us that this is a community of warmth, of wisdom, and welcoming of multiple truths.
Thanks, Linda. So please, if at any time during this service you have technical difficulties or you're noticing technical difficulties, please note it in the chat so that we can try to adjust it. Today, what we're going to be talking about is exploring religiously. So many of you may be familiar with what we call our RE programs. And Wendy and I are going to share conversations about this. Wendy is our Director of Programs and Membership, and so she's been responsible for religious education exploration for a while. And actually, before I became minister, that was my job here too. So we're going to tag team a little bit on this. And I'm going to start out by sharing a little bit of the history in our denomination of our educational programs and the way we've done that. And Wendy's going to talk about that specifically at Westside. And then we're going to reflect a little bit about what that means. So the basic history in Unitarian Universalism, I started as a religious education director many years ago in about 2002 2001, 2002. And at that time, and prior to that time, our programs, primarily for children and youth, were educational programs. And they rotated between three basic topics. There were curricula that were created by the denomination, and churches would rotate every 3 years. They'd do one of these three topics, rotation. So one topic was Judeo-Christian history and heritage, and there was curricula that was designed to teach kids about Jewish and Christian history and stories and religion. And then there was a year that was called Holidays and Holy Days, which was all about other cultures and based on the holidays of all different traditions and cultures. And then there was a year that was about world religions. So those were the three topics that were typically taught. And what happened was somewhere, I think probably around the 90s, maybe around 2000, somebody stepped back and did a little review of, well, what has been happening with children who become adults coming out of these programs? And what they discovered was that the kids would grow up knowing all sorts of things about all kinds of other religions, but when they were asked, well, what's a UU? They couldn't answer the question. They had no clue. They had no way to articulate what it actually meant to be Unitarian Universalist in that context. So about that same time, so the denomination has gone through a lot of structural changes. We're actually, as Linda mentioned, this quarter, we are our share of the plate. Any donations that come in extra to the church during this quarter go to the denomination to support the denomination. The denomination has experienced a lot of financial downsizing in the last probably 25 years. The offices have gotten smaller and smaller. The number of offices has changed, and their purposes have changed. There used to be a religious education office at the UUA. And then that changed to, for a while, it was lifespan learning. And then it changed multiple different times. So during this period, when we were figuring out that people who had grown up in Unitarian Universalism had no way to articulate what it meant to actually be Unitarian Universalist, the denomination stopped producing educational materials. So for I think it was about 15 years, 10, 15 years, something like that, the Unitarian Universalist Association as a whole did not produce any curricula materials for children and youth. Like, it just stopped. Now, the one curriculum during this time that was a denominational curricula that was still very active and being used was what's called OWL, Our Whole Lives, which is a lifespan sexuality education curriculum. And it's primarily taught 7th, 8th, and 9th graders, but there's also a high school version, an adult version, and a younger version. So that curriculum was consistent during this period, but the denomination wasn't producing any new materials. So during that time, a bunch of rogue religious education directors and ministers decided that we needed to fill the gap. So a bunch of people started writing their own materials to teach. And a sort of a rogue concordance or group developed called UU Cards, which was UU Curriculum and Resource Developers. So when I was a religious education director, I didn't get any of my materials from the Unitarian Universalist Association. I went to the Cards group and we started using their materials. And what happened was eventually, after about, I think it was about 10 years, 12 years maybe, the numbers are a little tricky because the UUA started working on a curriculum and it took them about 7 years to develop this one curriculum that they finally did develop, called Tapestry of Faith. And as Wendy will tell you in a minute, that was where she started. When she started her work with religious education, it was when Tapestry of Faith was first out. in the years since then, what has happened is that the denomination is really not producing materials for children and youth, really. But they are producing a lot of materials for adult programs. So a lot of social justice programs, a lot of educational programs for racial justice, curricula to match books that we are reading as a denomination and things like that. So that's the shift that's happened. There's been a significant cultural shift in the denomination about what materials are available and who's producing them. And Wendy's going to talk a little bit about what that looks like here at Westside.
So I came into Westside, let's see, as the Director of Religious Education in the summer of 2015. And I had spent several years in the RE committee and the program at Tennessee Valley. So as Carol said, I came in right as they were introducing Tapestry of Faith. And the other thing that was happening at Tennessee Valley, and I think other churches as well, is that in the rotation of those three pronged, yearly kind of focuses, Tennessee Valley had also added in the UU heritage, so UU heritage and history. So it was kind of a 4-year, it extended into like a 4-year rotation between these different topics. And so I came into Westside having done that and having worked with that curriculum and having worked with those different year, thematic year kinds of focuses. And when I came here, we were also using curriculum, and most of our energy and time was spent in preparing lessons based on this curriculum from the UUA. And we had to cut some of the older curriculum that people loved and that were volunteers, and so they carried that forward as well. And we also had Lori Allian did the Lori, remind me of the program. I'm just totally blanking out on it.
Spirit play.
Spirit play.
Spirit play. Yeah, we did that at Tennessee Valley too, and that is a beautiful program. And we ended up kind of moving that into the older, because that was mostly primarily for like preschool age, kindergarten, first grade, and we ended up extending that out when we started blending our classrooms into filling in more ages. We didn't have a large enough group to separate into small groups. So that was a beautiful curriculum to be able to use with multiple ages, because it was really story-based and discussion-based. So we kind of did this bridging between a real curriculum-based, focused yearly rotation when Carol and I had begun working together a little more closely over the first year especially, and then the second year. And we realized that even in worship that we were starting to move to more thematic kinds of planning and discussion and choosing which topics we were going to talk about. And so what ended up happening is that got reflected in the children's RE too. And we started to move away from all of that kind of didactic curriculum, lesson planning kind of model into more of a discussion in response to the topics that were being discussed and brought to the congregation through worship. And the children would have had some engagement with that through the Story for All Ages, which was also reflecting and mirroring what was happening in the worship topics. So we would have our Story for All Ages, and then the children would go back to the classrooms, and then we would have a discussion about what was happening in the Story for All Ages. And then we would plan activities or different projects around those topics. And so that way we thought it would be really nice and integrated that the kids could go home and talk with their parents around the same kinds of ideas that were expressed either at the adult or in the worship service or in the kids programming. And so when we started doing that, we kept some of the structure of the RE for the kids, and generally we always had the same kind of elements, that we would do a chalice lighting and we would say our UU words with all their little hand symbols, and then we would do what we call the pom-pom check-in, and it was basically concerns and joys and concerns sharing. We have little pom-poms that we would put in a vase, and everyone took their turn. And then we would do yoga, and then there would always be snack, and usually after yoga, everyone would be famished, so we would have to eat. And then we would get into some kind of discussion around eating, and then we would do our project. And as the time went on and we were using this model, we realized that, you know, what was really needed was fellowship and a little more autonomy. And the kids just kind of wanted to play. They've got curriculum 5 days a week, every day at school. And so we realized that we were really running towards more of a free form and rogue kind of way. We were still embodying and practicing UU principles, and we were naming them and we were speaking to them, and we would do activities as well. But sometimes they just happened on the playground, you know, and sometimes they happened in kind of spontaneous play. And that is also a spirit play kind of, you know, this wondering and embodiment and enactment of wondering. And Carol can probably jump back in here too, but we've also, in this arc, we've also seen this happen with adult RE, is that while we love the curriculum-based didactic kind of educational aspects of some of the adult RE, what we've seen is that most of the groups are really interested in having more open conversation. We moved our nonviolent communication program or curriculum, which we were calling compassionate, I can't remember what we called it, but anyway, we moved it to compassionate conversations. It was a practice group, and then we decided to, instead of just teaching the model, we would enact it. So that became one of our first real discussion-based groups. And then even more recently, our Thursday evening adult RE has turned into more of a discussion group. And what we see and what we're celebrating is the fact that learners of all ages really are more interested in taking authority over their own exploration and aren't really so interested in being passive receptors of education about a topic, that there's more engagement and community building around this model of adult and children's religious exploration.
So what Wendy's describing, Wendy, do you have anything else to add about the difference between education and exploration?
I think just to kind of reiterate, just that the education seems to be coming from a body of knowledge that is to be kind of handed over, whereas the exploration is like, hey, we're interested in this, and then we find curriculum to match that, as opposed to saying this is what you need to learn. We're saying, hey, this is what's coming up, and we're going to meet that, we're going to match that, we're going to follow that and nurture that along.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So what's interesting about all this is that this is a shift that's happened in our own congregation, but it's also happened in the denomination as a whole. We voted, I think it was in about 2017, maybe. I think that the board actually voted to change the name from religious education to religious exploration, or the committee voted to do that and the board approved it. But we made that a formal change. Now, what's interesting about that is we kept that acronym RE. And I want to talk about that a little bit. And this is a slightly more theoretical part about it. Some congregations don't use that RE name anymore because it's religious education or religious exploration. So when I started my career in Unitarian Universalism, I was a director of religious education. And think about the meanings of those words. I was directing, it was religious, and it was educational, right? That was my first job. That's really changed. My first church was outside San Francisco, and it was a pretty large church with about 50 children and adults, or 50 children and about 200 adults. And I was doing educational programs, just like Wendy describes. But one of the things I always would think about when I was in that situation was, for the longest time, when I was a kid, I attended Catholic church on Sundays, but I hung out with my friends on Wednesdays at the Baptist church. And at the Baptist church, they put as much emphasis on the adult programs as on the kids programs. And everybody went to worship together. And that was interesting to me. That was true in the Catholic Church as well. In the Catholic Church, We did not have CCD. Any of you who are Catholics will recognize that term, right? It stands for Co-Fraternity of Christian Doctrine. It's also called the Catechism, right? Our classes were not at the same time as Sunday morning services. They were at a different time because the idea was that everyone was supposed to be learning together and everyone was supposed to be worshiping together. There was a lot of controversy around that in Unitarian Universalism. At about the time I was coming in, churches had a tradition, as Wendy described, of children were only in the worship service for the first 10 or 15 minutes. Then they left because somehow that environment wasn't appropriate for children. And what's really interesting about that is in the denomination as a whole, we began to have this philosophical shift that said kids are certainly capable of being part of our worshiping community. And one of the things we changed here was that we set up a children's area in the sanctuary. And we said the kids are going to stay with us. Every other week, the kids are going to stay in the room and do the whole worship service with us. So we had to adjust. And that was a big philosophical shift that said kids and youth and adults all worship together. And also we all are learners. So this was a big shift, and it has been a big shift in the denomination. So that's a change. And the idea behind that is really a philosophical one that says we are all capable of being religious, worshiping, and we are all capable of learning, right? Exploration. So that shift has had some tensions around it in our faith tradition, because it's true that kids in worship make noise. They wiggle. And we started doing things to kind of encourage the grown-ups to start acting like kids. We started encouraging the grown-ups in the building to start wiggling. One of the first things I did, and this was before I got here in my first church, I started developing a Sunday morning service. We have done it here a couple of times, where we had a switching day, where what happened with the service was everybody went in the sanctuary, and for the first 10 minutes, the adults got to stay in the room. And the story for all ages, the kids got to stay in the seats, and the adults had to go sit up in front and listen to the story. And then the adults all got kicked out of the sanctuary and sent to the back rooms. And the kids got to stay in the sanctuary, and they got to do whatever they wanted. So in my first church, they all got a chance to talk on the microphone. They all got a chance to ring the bowl. They all got a chance to light a candle. They all got a chance to whatever, right? Because what had been happening is we had been educating our children to think that they didn't belong in our sanctuaries, and that they should be relegated to the back hall. And they didn't feel a sense of ownership of that room. So we started switching that up. And we started switching that up at Westside. So what does it mean to be religious explorers? And who's qualified to do that? So that shift in age-based separation has been a point of conversation and sometimes tension in our denomination. But the word religious is also a sticking point, okay? The word religious, and we kept it purposefully, not just because we didn't want to give up the RE acronym, but also because it has meaning. Some congregations let go of that. They say lifespan learning as a way of really claiming that lifespan community idea. But we've kept RE, religious exploration. But what does it mean to explore religiously? And this is one of the challenges we have as a Unitarian Universalist. We have rightfully so resisted sort of the dogmatic, fear-based models of religious education. All right, we have a resistance to that for good reasons. Like education, the religious structures that a lot of us come from imply restriction and unexamined assumptions, and also social inequity. So many UUs might use the term spiritual instead of religious. Others might use intellectual instead of religious, and others might use the term moral instead of religious. Now, so why religio? Scholars are still arguing about the origin of that word, religion, but there's a few good candidates for its meaning. So one of them, religio, means to read again, to study. This is Cicero's version. It's the path of studying. Another version that we don't particularly like comes from Julius Caesar, who meant it as a binding oath, to be bound, to commit to a certain oath or doctrine. But the one that I like best comes from Old French, and it means devotion to what is sacred or moral. So often you conflate the word religion with a certain kind of theological state, a certain theological belief system. And we also associate that with subservience. But if we throw that word out entirely, if we throw out the religio part entirely, we have a tendency to forget something really important that we're here to do, which is to engage theologically. And what I mean by this is that the church or the temple or the synagogue or the mosque has a different role in society than, for example, the school. Okay? We have to acknowledge that there's something else we do here that isn't what happens in school. And that something is religious or theological thinking. And we need to remember that. Now, it doesn't mean we have to have strict doctrine, but it does mean we're doing something different. When we explore religiously, we go beyond the boundaries of what can be known in an absolute sense. In our schools, we do not want our kids taught myths as if they were facts, right? We want them taught as stories of cultural value and meaning, maybe, but we're not going to talk about them as facts or as knowingness. In our schools, we don't want teachers to posit ideas about ultimate questions like, where do we go after we die? Or is there such a thing as God? These sorts of questions are big questions. And although Unitarian Universalists do not want to insist on shared answers to those questions, we connect around the questions themselves. It is hard as human beings to avoid big questions, and we need some place to ask them and to talk about them. What I like best about Unitarian Universalism is that we explore those questions. We're not afraid to dive into big theological issues, but we do it without having to have solid answers. So for me, that's what it means to explore religiously. It wouldn't be enough if we stopped at intellectual education, passing on facts, sharing data about what's already known. It wouldn't be even enough for me to talk about what other people have said on big questions as cultural information. I want to grapple with those questions, and I want to do it in community. I want to grapple with big questions that I may never be able to answer with other people who are grappling too. I want to be part of a community that's willing to ask big questions and not necessarily agree on their answers. Actually, I want to be part of a community that's willing to ask big questions and leave them as questions. So this is different than education. This is different than what schools do. This is to explore religiously. And I hope that we can continue to do that, explore our world and our lives and big questions in a religious way here, which is to grapple with what is bigger than us, things that we can't pin down, things that we can't give a solid answer to. Often we think that to be religious means to give simplistic answers to impossible questions, but that's not what it has to mean. It can mean just simply grappling with the big questions. So I hope, and Wendy hopes, I think I can say this for her, that you're here to bring your big questions, the ones that are pretty impossible to answer firmly. We as a community come together to do that because those questions are intimidating sometimes, and they're exciting and they're confusing. And it's easiest to do that when we have support and mutual engagement. That's what makes community rich and meaningful for us, sharing the journeys and our ups and downs. It's why we have classes that are called Building Your Own Theology, right? We build theologies together. So our community is a place for religious, theological, big question exploration. And we are excited to continue doing that, both as we worship together and as we share in groups and discussions. And also we like to do that as a community of all ages together. Sometimes in smaller groups, sometimes with people splitting off by being kids or youth, and sometimes all in the same place together. So I invite you to consider the kinds of questions you want to bring. What are the questions you're grappling with? Of course, we share data and information from our rich resources as a community. So if you know what your questions are, or if you don't know what your questions are and are willing to ask them into the space of community, someone might have information that's helpful to you, and other people might just be willing to listen to you. So that's something I invite us to continue to do as we go into coffee hour in a few minutes. And also in our Thursday evening discussions, we will have some more sort of educational classes coming up in the spring. And also in our compassionate conversations that we do on second and fourth Sunday mornings. Those are places where information and exploration all work together. We often say that the chalice we light is a symbol of truth. But isn't it interesting? We don't say which truth. It really isn't a symbol of one particular truth so much as it's a symbol of lighting the path in search of truth, which is a journey that never stops. So we're going to be extinguishing the chalice in a second here. But I would say that we continue to bring the light of curiosity and the warmth of companionship into our hearts. And Wendy's going to show us how we do this with the kids. So I'm going to ask Wendy.
Yes, so again, is bringing in these rituals and these patterns that we do in the sanctuary into the children's RE. We always held hands at the end of our time together to close our circle and to close our time together. And that's the same thing we did in the sanctuary during our worship services. And so when we went online, we would end our children's services by putting our hands up in the corners of our screens. And so that when you can see everybody together, and you can do this right now, we can hold hands virtually. You can see you're touching your neighbor's corner of the screen if you put your hands up. And so that's our way of continuing that tradition and to signify and to symbolize that we are still in touch with each other, that we are still connected.
So I extinguish the chalice, but not that light of curiosity, the warmth of companionship for the journey, and the fire of learning and exploration that lives in our hearts. I hope you all go in peace. And if you choose to stay for coffee hour, we can have discussions about whatever it is that's in your heart and mind today.